Morning. Bonjour, sénatrices et sénateurs. Welcome, bienvenue, et merci. Thank you for joining us this morning for our third Senators for Climate Solutions session of 2023 on the very important topic of climate solutions in the agricultural sector. I'd like to acknowledge that we're having this session on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, whose presence here reaches back to time immemorial. As co-chairs of Senators for Climate Solutions, Senator Couture and I are pleased to welcome our panelists, Brent Preston, President of Farmers for Climate Solutions, and his colleague, Andrew Rushmore, Farm Resilience Mentorship Program Director, Scott Ross, who's the Executive Director of the Canadian Federation of Agriculture, and Professor David Burton, Director of the Center for Sustainable Soil Management at Dalhousie University. So we have people from coast to coast here on this call. We're delighted that our colleague Senator Black has agreed to moderate today's panel. There's no one better to serve as today's moderator. As we all know, Senator Black is a highly effective and dogged champion for the agriculture sector, and he has an extensive background in agriculture, rural development, shared from our shared alma mater, the University of Guelph, also Senator Sorensen, and an extensive background in leadership development. Senator Black has also helped us structure this panel and has made the very important initial connections to our panelists. Now, just before I turn the program over to Senator Black, please note that on the bottom right of your Zoom window, you can find the icon that indicates interpretation. We are hoping, and I'm sure we will be sent a little message. Okay, it's not, translation is not possible. Okay, I'm not quite sure what happened, but unfortunately, although we prearranged the translation, it is not available. I'm very sorry for that because that is a standard that we try to meet for every one of our meetings. In order to speak during the meeting, you'll require a Senate grade headset. I'd like to thank our guests very much for joining us today and thank our colleague, Senator Black, for hosting. We're very much looking forward to hearing from all of you and hearing what you have to say. Over to you, Senator Black.
Thanks very much, Mary, and thanks for inviting me to be moderator, Stan and Mary. And Mary, thanks very much for your kind words. Given that we have no translation, I expect that we won't need headsets if those folks want to just ask the questions, but that'll be up to you as individuals. Today, we have with us experts who bring important perspectives about climate solutions in the agricultural sector. To set the stage, according to the 2030 emissions reduction plan, emissions from Canada's agriculture sector were 73 megatons in 2019, accounting for about 10% of Canada's total emissions. This sector is also one of the main sources of methane emissions, according to some research, contributing 29% of Canada's total methane emissions in 2019. Given these numbers and given Canada's commitment to reach its emission reduction target of 40% below 2005 levels by 2030 and net zero emissions by 2050, the overarching question is, how do we get to there from here? So I'm delighted today to have our panelists. And my first question, therefore, is for Brent, Andrew, and Scott. And that's the question. How do we get there from here? What are the key solutions in the agriculture sector? What federal policies would be most helpful to farmers to enhance their capabilities to reduce their impacts on the environment and adapt to future climate-related challenges? I'll leave it to you. We'll start with Brent, followed by Andrew and Scott in that order. Brent.
Great. Thanks, Senator Black. I think that the short answer to how do we get there from here is it's going to be difficult. It's not an easy path, but we think there is a pathway to get there from here. Scott and I right now are I'm actually in Ottawa, and we're in meetings together, working on the sustainable agriculture strategy that Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada is developing right now, and this is exactly the question we're grappling with. I think for a little background, the thing that makes getting toward net zero in agriculture challenging is that we produce all three of the main greenhouse gases. So agriculture is a source of carbon dioxide from the fuel that we burn in our machinery, the fuel we use to dry grain, to heat our barns, but also from our soils. Certain management practices of agricultural soils can release carbon that's stored as soil organic matter into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. We also produce methane, Senator Black. Most of that comes from the digestive systems of ruminants, so primarily cattle in Canada. The natural process of digestion in ruminant animals produces methane gas, and there's also methane released from stored manure. Then we also are an important source of nitrous oxide. So this is a very powerful greenhouse gas, and that's coming primarily from the use of synthetic nitrogen fertilizers. So you can think of it roughly as sort of a third, a third, a third. It's not really exactly that. So it's a challenge when we have multiple sources of greenhouse gases and primarily produced through biological processes that are inherent in the farming process. The advantage we have, though, is that we can also be a site for significant carbon sequestration. So our agricultural lands, if managed properly, can draw carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and store it in our soils, in our agricultural soils, which has lots and lots of benefits for farmers, but also in the parts of our agricultural landscape that we're not actively that we're not growing crops on, in our grasslands, our wetlands, our forested areas. So farmers, as managers of a huge portion of Canada's landmass, have the opportunity to store a lot of carbon. So the really simple answer to how do we get there from here is that we increase the amount of carbon we're sequestering on our lands, and we decrease the amount of greenhouse gases that we're emitting. And basically, right now, to get to net zero, we'd be looking at something like cutting our emissions in half, reducing our agricultural emissions by 50%, and roughly doubling the amount of sequestration we're doing. So it's a big challenge, but I really think it's doable. And maybe I'll pass it over to Andrew to talk about some of the specific practices that will help us achieve those goals.
Andrew, thanks very much.
That's great. Thanks so much, Senator Black, and to Senators for Climate Solutions as well for inviting us all. This is great, and thanks, Brent. Well, Brent's left me a chance to kind of do a little bit of the glory here, because he's sort of set up that it's difficult. It's going to be difficult to get from here to there, and that there's no question. But of course, our work at Farmers for Climate Solutions is focused on the solutions part, and we do have solutions. Getting to 2050 is a bit murkier and a bit further out. I'm going to focus for now on sort of getting to 2030, and what the big take-home message here is. One of the solutions is to engage farmers directly. Farmers have solutions to kind of get us from here to there. We're ready. We're able to do our part to reduce emissions and sequester carbon, but we definitely need support from the government to implement a few targeted, low-cost, practical, best management practices on farm. And Farmers for Climate Solutions has some very clear suggestions around that in a recent report we've written called Rooted in Climate Action. This report is a suite of recommendations we put forward to the government into the lead up to the agriculture policy framework, the sort of 5-year major public funding agreement here in agriculture. So that report contains 19 specific practices or best management practice recommendations. Each one of them in the report is quantified and costed. I'll say a note about how this report was drawn up, or how we came up with this report. This was a farmer-led task force. Okay, so there were farmer chairs leading a group of 17 researchers and experts in various fields: agricultural greenhouse gas emissions, agricultural economics, agricultural policy, equity in agriculture. And this farmer-led task force came up with these 19 specific recommendations, which, as I say, were quantified and costed, all backed by scientific evidence, that are practical to implement, They're proven already. They're practices that farmers are using. They're low cost and they're ready to go. Farmers can implement them on their farms now to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and increase carbon sequestration and farm resilience. If I were to group those 19 practices into 5 broad buckets, what we're looking at here is nitrogen management, and that's David Burton's specialty, and manure handling and storage is a second bucket. Livestock management, which sort of centers around largely around rotational grazing, but also pasture management. Soil, which is mostly focused on various methods of cover cropping, planting non-cash crops in the soil that suck up excess nitrogen, but also draw down carbon to put into the soil. And then the 5th one is wetland and tree management. So I won't go into the details of all 19 because that'll take us forever, but implementing all the recommendations contained in that report would reduce our absolute sector emissions by 14% by 2028. And if you break that down a little bit or put in different ways, that's a 10 megaton emissions reduction, but it also includes a 6 megaton reduction if you're counting carbon sequestration over and above that 10 megaton emission reduction. If you cost it out, the average cost across all 19 of those best management practices is $40 a ton CO2 equivalent, $40 per ton of CO2 equivalent. And if you compare that to the government's carbon price and what that's supposed to go up to over time, that's a steal of a deal per ton. The total cost of implementing all those recommendations by 2028 would be $2.1 billion, and the costs ramp up over the 5 years of the APF, but it would be an average annual cost of $414 million. So it's important to note in that report, though, the way we costed it out, that's those costs are only related to incentivizing farmers. And that's what we focused on, because that is something we feel really strongly is in this shorter window from now to 2030. That's an important way to make change is incentives to farmers, supporting farmers to do this. Farmers are going to be generally more receptive to incentives, and those incentives that we suggested include a mix of cost share programs, per acre payments, rebates, bonus payments for adopting multiple practices. So that does not include the cost of program delivery, additional government staff, research and data collection. But there's a couple key differences that I'll just finish on here between what we recommend in this report and what has come out in previous agricultural policy frameworks. And the key thing to highlight here is we're promoting a systems approach. So not just adopting and incentivizing the adoption of one best management practice, but multiple best management practices, because you see the benefits sort of increase exponentially in a way by adopting more best management practices. But also we're advocating for a higher level of coordination between the provinces. And, if you've got more programs related to climate and agriculture, some coordination between those programs as well. And also that it will be very important to involve farmers from equity deserving groups so that they have access to these supports as well. So that report was kind of a companion piece to another report that we put out that I won't go into about business risk management, but that sort of brings us to 2028 or close to 2030. The pathway to 2050, we're right in the middle of it now, convening the next task force to address the pathways in the sector to 2050. It's more uncertain. It will certainly be more disruptive to the sector. But I know Brent mentioned the sustainable agriculture strategy is looking at that too. So I'll leave it there for now.
Thanks very much, Andrew. And I want to ask Scott to wade in now. Scott Ross. Scott, we don't hear you. Scott, there you go.
Okay, sorry about that. Hooking up the headset, little glitch. So thank you first and foremost, Senators, for having me this morning. So I am Scott Ross, the Executive Director of the Canadian Federation of Agriculture. And as Brent alluded to, we're in the middle of 2 days of meetings currently working on the sustainable agriculture strategy and in a context of real co-development with farmers and ENGOs and other stakeholders. And I think it's always nice to speak last in these sorts of panels, because a lot of what both Brent and Andrew discussed already, I think I'll be reiterating to some extent. But there's no simple solution to this issue. I think what what Brent referenced in respect to the need for a strategic approach is critical, because we're dealing with a large country with significant regional variation, scale dynamics, where you're seeing having to contend with realities across very different sizes and types of production that are managing very complex ecological systems at the same time. And because of that, and the context, both globally and in value chains that farmers are operating within, it really does require a stakeholder-driven approach that really mobilizes and leverages the expertise of farmers, key advisors, private sector as well, because this really does require a long-term strategic approach that is quite transformative. And with that, I think I won't go into the substance of the specific practices, because I think from our perspective, with a strategic approach like this, what's most important is that we're creating an enabling environment for actors in the ecosystem to make decisions that are sustainable. And at the heart of it, as was referenced before, is ensuring there are incentives, both from the public and private sector, that really ensure that farmers as business owners have the right signals in place to be making sustainable decisions, and that there is that alignment between what's right for farm economics and also ensuring that it's aligned and synergistic with what's happening from a sustainability perspective. And I think one of the critical elements we see time and again that's come from our membership in this discussion is certainly the need to invest in research and drive progress on regulatory modernization to support approval and acceptance and commercialization of innovations. And at the end of the day, what we really see as a critical investment in this entire process is extension and KTT, and the need to really ensure that we're taking research and finding pathways to get that in the hands of farmers, and ensuring that there is that communication and supportive network, both through formal advisors and through peer-to-peer networking and mentorship opportunities as well. I think the nature of this change is very complicated, and it's not possible to promote one-size-fits-all solutions here. And so there does need to be that interface for tailored on-farm discussions around exactly what are the right decisions to make, and empowering farmers to be making those decisions. One of the contexts I think that's always important in this too is that Canada is not operating in a vacuum here. And so the decisions that are made domestically in Canada have bearing not only on the consumption practices of Canadians, but also globally. And I do think we need to be very cognizant as we're working through this, that we are very careful not to displace Canadian production or put constraints on it where we would see inputs coming in, or imports from other countries rather, that are, for example, having a much higher emissions intensity. I know Canadian cattle is a prime example of a very low emissions intensity sector globally compared to the global average. And I think if decisions made in an effort to promote sustainability in Canada undermine our ability to be profitable and productive, at the end of the day, there's a potential for a net loss globally here. And we need to consider that throughout this process. And I think it was touched upon as well, there's this added layer of complexity, because each of these practices intersects a whole host of different sustainability facets, whether it's investments in soil health that may impact biodiversity, whether positively or negatively. These trade-offs are what requires that real engagement with stakeholders, and that sense of a strategic approach that isn't tied to one solution for all. And so, when looking at this transformation, there's no getting away around it. There are significant costs involved, and those don't fall solely on the shoulders of government by any means. And that's why engaging the private sector and producers is so critical, to leverage and mobilize all the resources that are available. And that's really the long-term approach, I think, to get us to 2050. But in the short term, I think it's that cost issue that comes up time and again, with high fuel prices, high input prices today, and really immense pressure on farmer margins. Access to capital is such a critical issue today. And that is why we really look to short-term solutions like Bill C-234 as a critical step towards empowering farmers to have the working capital available to make investments in their farm, by ensuring that the exemptions for on-farm practices where there aren't viable alternatives are in place, and encouraging farmers then to have access to the capital they need to make on-farm decisions to support their sustainability. And so in this context, we're really talking about critical climate mitigation tools that farmers need these days, like grain drying, heating and cooling of livestock barns, to manage the extreme weather volatility they're facing. And ultimately, when talking about an enabling environment, there's an immense alignment between the push for efficiencies to reduce fuel use, input use that farmers are already looking at on a daily basis, and the need for capital to invest in further efficiencies and sustainability. And so, like I said, there's a particular approach, but we need to have a combination of both long and short-term strategies here to really start moving forward on what is not a singular issue.
Thanks very much, Scott. And yeah, we will take questions at the end of our session. Our goal is to end this this part of the discussion around 9:40. So there'll be lots of times for questions, and so I ask my colleague presenters to keep that in mind as well. My next question is for Professor David Burton. Professor Burton, do you think carbon markets could be a mechanism to reduce carbon emissions from agriculture? What are the pros and cons of this mechanism, and what role can the federal government play in supporting these markets if they're the right way to go? Dr. Burton.
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity. I certainly think they could be. We do need mechanisms that financially compensate producers for their efforts to reduce emissions or store carbon. We have to remember the producers are the ones that are making these decisions, bearing these costs. Farming is a business, and when only half of the product of that business is reflected in the bottom line, that half will drive the decision making. So we need to make sure that producers are indeed compensated for the environmental goods and services they generate on the farm. And one example is greenhouse gas emissions reductions. And so I think carbon markets may be one mechanism by which we could do this. The challenge, of course, is that carbon trading markets thus far have primarily been designed by accountants and lawyers and end up being rather complex and often return very little back to the producer. The pro is, of course, that they do give an economic value for those environmental goods and services. The con is the negative aspect of it is often that transactional costs consume far too much of the actual value of the credit, so little is returned back to the producer. We spend more on paperwork than the actual actions needed to generate the emissions reduction. And that's a problem. We need more simplified mechanisms to generate credits that are useful to the producer and can be implemented by the producer and return value back to them, and therefore will influence their decision-making processes on the farm. So the transactional costs should be something like 10% of the value of the credit, 90% being going back to the producer. And I think perhaps the reverse is true at the moment. Does the federal government have a role to play? Yes, I think they do. I mean, they have a very vested interest in realizing emissions reductions, but they also have the opportunities to create programs that will reward producers for these practices. And in some cases, the incentive programs that we've been seeing are ways in which that can be done. But I think in the end, we need long-term programs that actually allow producers to realize the value of providing these ecological goods and services as part of their production practices. So I think that's done. It's critical that is done in a manner that enables farmers to not get bogged down in red tape and to actually see value in implementing these sorts of practices, and carbon trading mechanisms are an example of that.
Thanks very much, Dr. Burton. My next question is for Brent and Andrew. How do each of you envision what Canada's farming sector will look like in 2050?
Well, that's a big question. And, you know, I have days where I'm very optimistic and some days when I'm less so. But in my optimistic days, I see a farming sector in 2050 where farming generally seeks to enhance and work within natural systems, that takes advantage of natural biological systems to reduce the amount of inputs that we need to buy as farmers, and makes us more profitable, more stable in terms of our financial position, where our margins improve because we are spending far less on synthetic inputs and gaining much more of what we need through the healthy, active biological systems that are thriving on our farms. I think that I know, Senator Black, you're very interested in the issue of soil health. I think that in 2050, what I see is a an absolute focus among farmers at maximizing their soil health, because I think that is the best way to both mitigate climate change and to adapt to the impacts of climate change, which we're already seeing. But the more we have a healthy biologically active soil with lots and lots of organic matter, that means we've been pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. We've been increasing the water holding capacity of our soils. We're increasing the fertility and productivity of those soils. And we are ensuring ourselves against the extreme weather events, whether it's drought or extreme rainfall, making our operations much more resilient. So really, what I see in 2050 is an agricultural system that recognizes that our financial viability and our financial future and our sustainability and environmental performance are not at loggerheads. It's not a choice between one or the other, but that they're seen as absolutely intertwined and inextricably linked, that you can't have one without the other.
Thank you. Andrew, thoughts?
Yeah, it's going to look like Brent and I are reading from the exact same hymnal here. I'm just going to try and provide a slightly different angle on a similar theme, which, just as Brent said, I think I used to see this when I was farming in an order of primacy that put ecological health first and then economic health next. I have since grown to, if I'm looking forward to 2050 and envisioning what the agriculture sector looks like, it's clear to me that there's no question we have to see it less as an extractive industry and more, we have to shift our mind frame about how we think of it, that it's less of an extractive industry, but more as a closed loop set of ecological relationships, but enmeshed with those ecological relationships, all the economic relationships. But so far we've, as a society, put most of our weight on the economic relationships in agriculture in a lot of ways, and not on the ecological relationships. And then, it's a sort of Venn diagram. I'm going to bring social relationships into this too, and farmer mental health, because there's a crisis out there on that front that are linked to the economic and the ecological crises in agriculture as well. So I will say there is no health in agriculture without ecological health or farmer health or economic health. But while the whole system, like Brent said, is based on biological relationships and biological systems, farmers definitely need to be supported economically to steward those biological and ecological systems. And like David Burton said, there has to be compensation to farmers for stewarding ecological goods and services and doing a much better job of it than we have been, not by the fault of farmers. Like we hear over and over across the country talking to farmers, they're stressed out of their tree, they're debt ridden, and most of them are sort of working a job off the side, I'm sure you're aware, to pay for their farming habit. That has to change. Farmers have to not be seeing so much risk at every single turn. They have to feel like they can reasonably make a living at farming in order to be empowered to make the right decisions, like Scott was saying, on the ecological side. So I would say the same as Brent and Senator Black. I know from your presentation and your work on soil health, you would likely, well, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I know you're focused on soil health, and that's the basis of everything in the ecological realm in agriculture. There's no question, just like Brent was saying, and I won't belabor the point. But the other thing I want to say is that I hope in 2050 we'll be viewing at a federal level all of our climate policy, all of our business risk management programs through a climate lens and through an ecological lens that will reward the practices more that preserve the environment and that make will reserve the climate smart will reward the climate smart practices that farmers make. But that we also, have to take farmer mental health seriously. But part of doing that is, if it were easier to make a living farming, we would not see the mental health crisis we're seeing right now in farming. But I think also a lot of farmers, this may be a bit esoteric for some, but I think that a lot of farmers feel disconnected to the land. They know that some farmers know they could make better choices in relation to how they care for the land, and they want to, but they don't feel like they have the support or that they're empowered to. So I think all those things are linked in that way. I would envision a sector that has far more research and extension, just like Scott mentioned. That's a key thing we're hearing all the time, and that we all know from experience, that we need more professional extension and also peer-to-peer extension. And then, particularly in this case, in climate smart agriculture. But also I would highlight what Scott said previously, that it would be a sector where there are choices for farmers. These are smart business people who need a range of choices, who can't have solutions forced on them. They need to be able to make choices that work for their farm and their context. I would envision more support for new and young entrants to agriculture, more support for mixed farms. And yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Scott, I have two more questions before we turn it over to the larger group, and I think there's lots of questions out there. Scott, are there any successful examples of government initiatives in other countries that have supported farmers to reduce their climate impact that could be adapted for our Canadian environment?
Yeah, I would say it's not an easy question to answer, as largely because most of the countries that are pursuing the similar journey to Canada are early days in that process, much like we are. And so there's not a wealth of data on exactly from a long-term perspective what will sort of bear fruit and be most impactful in this regard. But I do think there are some important lessons to be learned from international experiences. The first being not to rush the process. I think we've seen instances like the forced transition to organics in Sri Lanka that was disastrous for their local agricultural economy. And I think we have to be very measured and stakeholder driven in this to make sure that we're bringing people along in this process. I think if there's a continued sense of farmers seeing strategies imposed upon them rather than seeing themselves reflected in that, I think it does a disservice to this process. And I think for that same reason, building on what Andrew said, making sure there's not primacy of one facet of sustainability over others is critical. There really needs to be an interlinked sense of ensuring that climate solutions are not undermining farm livelihoods, they're supporting competitiveness, and that they're not leaving farmers wholly responsible to manage the realities of increased climate risk we're facing as well. Climate readiness has to be a real focus of this. And I will say there's some interesting examples coming out of the United States around conservation stewardship programs that have been in place for some time. And you see similar structures in Canada, although far less well-funded and not nationally available, like the ALICE program, that ensures that there is ecological goods and services programming support for conservation measures. But I think last year's investments in the United States around climate smart agriculture are also a very interesting model to look more closely at, where they dedicated $1 billion in funding to not only the implementation of best management practices, but also data measurement, monitoring, and verification, which is just so critical to accessing things like carbon markets and so many facets of this discussion. And then ultimately linking that to opportunities to develop markets and promote climate smart production. And I think it's that link to markets that is so critical and something we need to explore further in Canada when we're looking at a sustainability strategy for our country.
Thanks, Scott. David, how is the academic community working with the agricultural sector in its efforts to reduce emissions?
In several ways. One is all along we've been very involved in the discovery and documenting of the various practices that can reduce emissions. And I think we have to continue in that vein in generating peer-reviewed publications that would give authoritative evidence to the policymakers and the international community that the kinds of actions that we're implementing actually do result in reductions in the magnitude of those reductions such that they can be reflected in our national inventory report. Getting things in that report so that the actions of producers are reflected in our national emissions is a really critical task, and I think the academic community has an important role in that regard. Another and more emerging role is I think the academic community can play an important role in understanding the socioeconomic forces that are preventing some of these actions from being adopted. Looking at some of the farmer communication mechanisms, but also the economics of productions, such that we can incorporate the kinds of practices that will deliver these environmental goods and services into an economic model that will motivate producers to adopt these practices and enhance the profitability of their production systems. But finally, I think the academic community has a really important role in the tracking of the practices that are already being implemented on farm. I think both industry and government have interests in that, but I think it's the academic community that may be that independent arbitrator that can use technology and various other tools to actually take a picture of what we're doing and reflect that in a way that it can be translated into to the National Inventory Report. And this will involve all kinds of tools, including remote sensing and those kinds of things. But I think that's another emerging area where the academic community is engaged in sensing the state of our soil resources and reporting that back to Canadians so that they understand what the state of those resources are, and we can make decisions on how we can move forward. All different roles, but all different ways in which the academic community is engaging in this problem.
Thanks very much, Dr. Burton. Gentlemen, thanks for keeping your remarks to the point. And we're now at about 9:40, just a little before 9:40. And you can see we've already got a couple questions. I expect there'll be more. I have a few if there's not, but I'm looking forward to my colleagues diving into to your remarks and this discussion. I'll start off with Senator Marshall.
Yeah, sorry. Okay, can you hear me? No?
Can
No,
so.
Okay, great. First of all, thanks very much for the presentations. I found them to be very balanced. So the presentations were great. But I'm thinking about 2030 now, and I'm sure you're all aware of the reports that came from the Environmental Commissioner a couple of weeks ago. So you talked about costs and I think somebody mentioned, the mental health of farmers. Where do you think we are with regard to both farmers being able to cope with the additional costs plus their ability to manage change? And I'm thinking short term, 2030. I know some of you were speaking about 2050. Well, I'm not going to be here then. I'm thinking about 2030. So where do you think we are now? Because some of the farmers I've spoken to are quite stressed and very concerned with the cost of changes. So where do you think we are right now? Anybody?
Who wants to jump in on that? And again, we want to keep these answers succinct.
I can certainly take a first crack at it if that's okay. Yep. Thanks for the question, Senator. I think when we look at where we are today, I think there's no question that there's a lot of potential cost associated with this process. And a lot of it stems from the fact that in the current environment, when you look at the public versus private benefits of a lot of these practices, they predominantly fall into a space that is, and it's not exclusively that. I think issues like rotational grazing in cattle, there's a mutual win-win economic and public benefit. But many of these other practices currently, the signals to producers are this is an initiative that will come at some cost with limited sort of immediate return on investment. And there's a bit of a disconnect between the timelines for that ROI and the need to drive change in a more immediate fashion. And I do think when we talk about creating an enabling environment immediately, one of the first and most important steps, I think, is ensuring that we're focusing very much on climate readiness and giving producers support to manage the realities of extreme weather volatility, because risk management and the capital tied up in ensuring you're able to weather those storms and work through what are the realities of climate change that are impacting farmers on a daily basis is a real vital foundation to actually support everyone in moving forward so that they are not exclusively bearing that risk and tying up capital and otherwise sort of undermining their ability to invest in the sustainability solutions that are in front of them today.
Thanks, Scott. Anyone else want to take a crack at that? Okay. Brent, did you want to say something? No?
No, I agree with that.
Okay, thank you. Senator Quinn.
Thank you, panelists, for a very interesting series of presentations. And thank you, moderator, for asking very good, thought-provoking questions. And it caused me to want to ask a question, make a comment and ask a question. And one of the things that we talked about is 2050 and some reflections on that. my comment's more to do with the sustainability of things beyond what the nature of this, the theme of this topic is, but the sustainability of the farm itself. And I've met with a number of people from various areas of the agriculture business. And one of the common themes that I've asked about is the sustainability of the farm itself with the various pressures the farming communities under today, whether it be from, capital gains that needs to be paid when transferring the farm to a family member, to increasing costs, to new regulatory requirements, including those around the environment. And the whole question of food security, they're all linked together. And yet it seems that our country is facing an issue where there are fewer farmers every year. And the challenge of getting younger folks to engage and family members to engage on the continuation of that family business or get into the business seems to lack incentive. It seems to be something that people would look at and say, man, it's just too big a hill to climb. I'm just wondering if there's any commentary on that, the things that we're trying to do. I think one of our panelists said that, farmers need to be helped along the way. We need to take a progressive approach, but not an onerously, oppressive approach. So I'm just wondering about the sustainability of the farms. And I got to add that Senator Black made some commentary in the Senate a few weeks back about soil health. And I think if I remember Senator Black, within 50 years, we're in danger of losing, all or certainly significant amounts of our soil. All these factors together should really be of concern, I think. So I'd be interested in commentary on that and on food security, because that's where it all ends up. Thank you.
Who would like to take a start?
I may take a first step.
Please, David.
I think one of the challenges is we've fallen into a mindset that yield of a particular product is the only product of agriculture. We've commodified agriculture, so we're creating these commodities that we put into a global market. We have to remember that several major products of the farming enterprise are environmental goods and services, but also investment in the rural economy. And we have to find ways in which those roles of those farms are better reflected in our overall understanding of farm policy, because we're not just producing yield. We're producing a quality product, so the quality of the food's important, but we're also servicing that rural community and providing those environmental goods and services. And there needs to be a way in which those other roles are balanced against simply the production of a commodity. And I think that will also help to reduce some of the stress on farmers if they're being compensated for that. So they see that as alternate revenue streams as well that are sustaining their ability to remain economically viable.
I've got something. It's my second one.
If I could just quickly jump in on that as well, I think that sort of thinking about what Professor Burton is saying and what Scott was saying, a lot of and the question about the financial viability of farms in the short term, a lot of the practices that have the biggest potential to reduce emissions and to increase resilience have a net financial benefit to farmers, but it often takes quite a number of years of practice in order to realize those benefits. And when you're dealing with a farmer who has really short-term needs to service debt and to ensure the financial viability of the farm for this particular growing season, it's hard to make investments in practices that are going to take 3, 4, 5 years to pay off. So I think that's an area where it's really critical, where governments can play a critical role in bridging that gap, giving people the ability to de-risk and take on new practices that over the long run are going to be financially and environmentally beneficial, but in the short term are going to be costly. And so some of we've started having some government programs that address that need, but they often, like the On-Farm Climate Action Fund, which a really important government initiative over the last couple of years, supporting farmers to take on climate-friendly practices. That program only pays for 1 year of implementation, and we know that none of these practices start returning returning positive gains for farmers in the first year. That no one would argue that that's the case. So I think we need to think about the role of government in de-risking and giving farmers that bridge to get them to where they want to be, and they know they're going to be more profitable, but the short-term economic reality makes it difficult.
Thank you. Anyone else like to take a crack at that?
I would just like to add
Scott.
one brief
Yep,
point.
please.
One item I think that we are, very much dealing with when it comes to farm profitability these days is the new reality post-pandemic, and in a context of global supply disruptions, where input scarcity is becoming a reality that has both affordability and accessibility concerns. And we've certainly struck a cost of production committee looking at what's happening in farm margins in Canada. And one of the critical takeaways is the need to have a critical input strategy, not only looking at how we secure domestic production for some of those inputs that are critical to our sector today, but also identify emerging technologies and alternatives that we can be pursuing in the future to make sure that we are reducing our exposure to some of the volatility that exists in global markets as a result. And I will just touch on the other point the Senator raised around the importance of succession and the need to really look at adjusting the lifetime capital gains exemption to keep pace with inflation, and also look at how it can be more flexibly applied by farmers in the context of intergenerational transfers to make sure that we're setting up the next generation for success. And I think we do have to take a very close look at our Income Tax Act and ensure that we're creating structures that enable the continuance of family farming and ensure that we aren't driving undue consolidation or sales to foreign parties, for example, by virtue of making family farm transfers more complicated and costly than they need to be.
Great, thank you very much. I see Stan has a question up, but I think he's just given his time away. We have a question from Senator Marty Deacon, and thanks, Marty, for your kind words at the outset. Marty's question is: farmers over history in the past have had, I think, strong connections. Now they are overwhelmed and do not feel connected now as third and fourth generation farmers. When you listen to farmers, what is the hope that they have and count on for the future, in particular with respect to this topic? Folks, and we do have about 6 or 7 minutes, and then we'll turn it back over to our organizers.
I can take a first attempt here. I think in simple terms, what I hear farmers articulating is an interest in seeing the continued rise in interest in food equate to an interest in how food is produced, and that there is that move away from really looking at food in the context of a grocery store to better understanding how it's produced, and really building the linkages through tools like agriculture in the classroom from an early day to really start engendering a better sense of connectivity to where farming is happening, where food is produced. And in doing that, I think there are some real opportunities we've seen through, for the pandemic, for example, the shift in the rural exodus that sort of happened and people moving out of urban centers and an increased focus on rural community vibrancy. I really think the connection between agriculture and rural Canada is vital, and we really need to look at how we can strengthen that interface with the general public.
Thanks, Scott. Any Brent, Andrew, David, any thoughts? Okay.
Well, maybe
go ahead.
maybe just quickly, Senator Black. I also don't want to paint a picture of farmers sort of moping around the countryside, depressed and mentally ill. There's a huge problem with mental health in agriculture, as there are throughout society. And I don't want to generalize about farmers, because we have a huge diversity among our farm population. And, we have farmers who are climate change deniers, who don't think that this should be a focus and don't think we should be talking about this. But I think that they're a small minority, and that the sort of attitude toward environmental and climate issues in the farm community is changing rapidly. I was at the Canadian Federation of Agriculture annual general meeting a month or so ago, and the theme of the whole meeting was around environment and climate. And there wasn't a single speaker or delegate or anyone there who questioned whether or not that should be the focus of that meeting. I think that there are a large and growing number of farmers who are excited about the fact that we as farmers have agency in this fight against climate change. You know, I feel really privileged as a farmer that I don't have to just sit and watch the news and wring my hands and think the world is on fire and I can't do anything about it. I can do something about it every single day on my farm. And it's exciting for me to share information and share knowledge with my fellow farmers, to learn from other farmers about the practices that they're using. And you know, people like Professor Burton are vital in this fight and have a huge role to play. But a huge amount of the innovation around climate practices in agriculture are being developed and trialed and spread by farmers. So I think that we have to harness that energy and harness that enthusiasm and support those farmers so that everyone in the sector can see, yeah, this is a viable way forward.
Thank you. Dr. Kuchar. Quick question. We have 4 minutes.
Well, it's not going to be quick, but I'll synthesize it. But I want to make a comment actually from what Brent just said. The distress that's caused by realizing that things have to change. I mean, after all, the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones, but there are better options ahead. Emotionally brings us into one of two directions. It brings us into an internalizing of distress, which then has negative emotions, depression, anxiety, unhappiness, and that leads to withdrawal. Or it can lead us to externalizing those emotions, which we can generate into annoyance, anger, and activity, which Brent, you're channeling, and all the panelists are channeling really, really well. And actually, one of the issues around the mental health challenges in farmers is to help people understand that they aren't being overwhelmed, just like you said, Brent, by the negativity that's around in our culture, but by giving them agency to act. So I just wondered if you thought about it, and my background is a mental health background, but
can you tell?
Yeah, no, I don't know. I just floating off here. David, nice to see you. What are the organizations and farmers doing to try to help them understand this way that they can actually move to improve their own mental health? Because the last thing they need is more mental health treatment. What they really need is trying to understand the transition that they're going through.
Scott, you might want to take a crack at that. We'll make it quick, and Brent or Andrew, if you've got comments. But
yeah, I think there's sorry, Senator.
We want to honor the group's time. So carry on.
Yeah, I'll be very brief here. I think there's a couple elements. I think certainly one of the developments we've been really pleased to see is the development of a Center for Agricultural Wellbeing focused on agricultural mental health. I think to your point, where there is kind of tension and concern around the sustainability agenda and its implications on farm, I think, you know, one of the elements that came out in our sustainable ag strategy discussions over the last 2 days was the opportunities that are available, not only to talk about future transformations, but to actually highlight the transformations that have been happening already in agriculture and ensure that we're looking to the successes that have been in place, like the adoption of no-till, low-till agriculture across Western Canada and the immense improvements in soil health that have already happened in that space. And I think one of the sort of tunnel vision aspects of this discussion is we often talk about transformation as a process of vilifying what we're doing today without stepping back and looking to highlight all the good work that's gone in there. And I think the more we can kind of draw those lines and demonstrate that this is part of a long-term journey that farmers have already been very well invested in, and that there's more to be done, no question, will go a long way in helping shape the response farmers have to these discussions. And that's why having farmers in the room co-develop strategies and tools is just so vital to make sure that it is landing appropriately and not creating that sort of defensiveness that isn't necessary to the process.
Thanks, Scott. Any other comments quickly, Andrew? Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just jump in here and say that, you know, like one of the initiatives that Farmers for Climate Solutions has taken on is we're rolling out a program called the Farm Resilience Mentorship Program. It's a peer-to-peer program to train farmers across the country in adopting climate-friendly farm practices. And I think that's, so that's one example, I think, of a way to give agency to farmers that we're hearing from farmers is a good idea and is working well and is giving people some hope in response to the last question as well. That this is a program that's free to farmers, where we're recruiting farmers who are experienced in these practices to train other farmers in adopting them, share the successes, share their challenges, which is equally important as sharing the successes. For letting farmers, for helping farmers feel like they're not alone. And we're hearing a lot from farmers that, if you're adopting a practice that isn't commonly adopted in your community around you, you can experience ostracization or kind of funny sideways glances. So part of what we're trying to do through this program is build a network across the country of farmers who are adopting these practices, and they can talk to one another, because you may be the only one in your community doing this or doing this in this particular way. And if you can't kind of connect with the folks immediately around you locally, at least you can connect with some folks across the country, both socially and in terms of the actual practices. So
Thanks, Andrew. So colleagues, you've heard from 4 wonderful people: Andrew, Brent, Scott, and David. Thank you for sharing the message that my colleagues have heard from me for 5.5 years now. Really appreciate your time with us today. I'm going to turn it over to Mary, but before I do that, I want to encourage my colleagues to check out a book that I read a few years ago called The New Farm by Mr. Brent Preston. You might be interested in it. Yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed the book, and so I would encourage you to check it out. It's available on Amazon. I just checked it out. So colleagues, back over to you, Mary.
And I will hand it over to Senator Kutcher, who will do the wrap up. But also, I just want to say thank you so much to each of our amazing panelists. And I bet Stan is doing the wrap up. And apologies to Senatrice Gerba that we did not get to her question, but we can put that question to our panelists and see if they can respond to us in writing. So Stan, over to you.
You're on mute, Stan.
I must be in the Senate, so I don't learn very fast. Anyhow, just thanks again to everyone. I apologize that we didn't have the French translation. We did have it all organized. We'll find out what went wrong, and we'll make sure that we have it for next time. And just want to thank the panelists. You were fabulous, and Senator Black for moving this agenda forward. And he's a huge champion in the Senate. And it's helped me, and I'm sure everyone here, learn about what solutions can happen within the agricultural sector to the challenges we're facing. So thank you, one and all, and to all our staff who helped put this session together. And hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day, and we will see you next time. Thank you so much. Walalio and merci à tous.